English is divided into three periods: Old English, Middle English, and Modern English. Old English period. It lasted from the 5th century to the 11th century. In the 5th century, the British Isles were invaded by the Germanic tribes of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, whose common language, which was English, displaced the Celtic dialects of the first inhabitants. From the names of the first two tribes, we get the term Anglo-Saxons to describe these people. Also, from the name of the first tribe, we get the name of their language, English, and their new home, England. These pagan settlers also gave us some weekday names, commemorating their gods Woden and Thor. Some words that they left us were man, woman, child, eat, and drink. At the end of the 6th century, Christian missionaries arrived in England and began to move through the land, converting people from their pagan beliefs to Catholic Christianity. Here, English makes contact with Latin, the language of the Church throughout Europe, which became the language of religion, high culture, literacy, and government. Then, poor Old English was eventually relegated to the language of peasants and the uneducated. Invaders were the Norsemen, also called Vikings, which were mostly from Denmark, and they settled in Britain. The changes in English made by the Norseman language, which was Old Norse, in this period include, besides deep lexical modifications, the breakdown of the particular Germanic system of declinations. Some words left by these tribes were take and day. The Middle English period, from the 11th century to the 15th century. This period begins with the arrival of the Norman French in England, following their victory at Hastings under William the Conqueror in 1066. For the next 200 years, French, or the English version of French, became the official language of the court and administration, and English was reduced to a colloquial language. French had its greatest impact on vocabulary. Approximately 50% of the English lexicon was of Latin and French origin, and half of these loans took place between 1250 and 1400, when the literary language was also fixed. For example, the translation of the Bible by J. Wycliffe and Stories of Canterbury by G. Chaucer. Also, the introduction of printing press in England by William Caxton in 1476 brought about significant changes, but because this method helped to establish and spread a standard language across the country, which included standardization of spellings and forms of grammar. Finally, the Modern English period, from the 15th century to present. During the early modern periods, the influence of English spread throughout the British Isles, and from the early 17th century onwards, its influence began to be felt around the world with the complex processes of exploration, colonization, and overseas trade that characterized Britain's external relations. Words were absorbed from all over the world via the languages of other trading and imperial nations such as Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. Also, new varieties of English emerged. More recently, English has become a lingua franca, a global language, regularly used and understood by many nations for whom English is not their first language.
Since the beginning, English has suffered many changes. This occurred due to many causes, either for comfort or need. These changes are very varied and they go from sound to syntactic and semantic changes. First, we will talk about the sound changes. From Middle to Modern English, some sounds disappeared from the pronunciation of certain words in a process described as sound loss. The initial H of many Old English words was lost, and some words lost sound but kept the spelling, resulting in the silent letters of contemporary written English. The sound change, known as metathesis, involves a reversal in positions of two sounds in a word. The person who pronounces the expression "pretty good" as something close to "pretty good" is producing an example of metathesis as a dialect variant within Modern English. Another type of sound change, known as epenthesis, involves the addition of a sound to the middle of a word. For example, the word timber is nowadays written as timber. Also, the addition of a P sound after the nasal M as empty can also be heard in some speakers' pronunciation, in the word something as something. Well, now we will talk about the syntactic changes. Some noticeable differences between the structure of sentences in Old and Modern English involve word order. In Old English texts we find the subject-verb-object order most common, but we can also find a number of different words and different orders that are no longer used. For example, the subject could follow the verb, as in he traveled, and the object could be placed before the verb, as in he saw him, or at the beginning of the sentence, as, for example, no man gave any to him. Also, in the last example we see a double negative construction. This was possible in Old English. Also, although this is no longer used or it is considered ungrammatical in Modern English. However, the most important change in the form of English sentence was the loss of a large number of inflectional suffixes from many parts of the speech. Now we will talk finally, about the semantic changes. The most obvious way in which Modern English differs from Old English is in the number of borrowed words that have come into the language since the Old English period. Nonetheless, many words have ceased to be used. A common Old English word for men was were, but it has fallen out of use, except in horror films where the compound werewolf occasionally appears. Two other processes are described as broadening and narrowing of meaning. An example of broadening of meaning is the change from holy day as a religious feast to the general break from work called a holiday. And the reverse process, called narrowing, has overtaken the word hunt, once used for any kind of dog, but now as hound, used only for some specific breeds. Another example is met, only used once for any kind of food, but today in Modern English it has only used for meat. Also, a different kind of narrowing can lead to a negative meaning for some words, such as vulgar, which used to mean ordinary, and naughty, which means to have nothing.